38,000 times. That is how many times the name Trump or his wife or his property appears inside the Epstein files. Not once, not twice, 38,000 times. And the woman sitting at the top of the Department of Justice, the woman who was supposed to investigate all of this, refused to answer a single question. Not one. So when Jasmine Crockett walked into that hearing room, she didn't come to play politics. She came with facts, cold, documented, undeniable facts. And what she revealed in the next 5 minutes didn't just shake that room, it shook the entire country. Stay right here, because what I'm about to show you changes everything. Let me take you back to the hearing room. The energy in that space was already tense before Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett even opened her mouth. Attorney General Pam Bondi was sitting right there at the witness table, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the United States of America, and she had already made it crystal clear that she was not going to answer questions. Not because she couldn't, not because she was legally protected, but because she simply chose not to, and that choice, that deliberate, calculated silence, told you everything you needed to know before a single fact was even presented. Now, most politicians in that room would have played it safe. They would have asked their standard questions, gotten their standard non-answers, and moved on. But Jasmine Crockett is not most politicians. And what she did next was something that nobody in that room and nobody watching at home was prepared for. Instead of directing her questions at Bondi, she turned to her colleague and asked 3 of the simplest, most basic moral questions that any human being with a conscience could answer. Right or wrong, raping children? Wrong. Right or wrong, killing random citizens? Wrong. Right or wrong, enriching yourself as the sitting president of the United States? Wrong. 3 questions, 3 answers. And the reason she asked her colleague instead of the Attorney General was devastating in its implication, because the Attorney General of the United States could not be trusted to answer even those. Think about what that means for a second. The person responsible for enforcing the laws of this country, the person who sits at the very top of the Department of Justice, was so compromised, so politically captured, so thoroughly untrustworthy that a sitting congresswoman didn't even bother directing basic moral questions at her. That is not normal. That is not how oversight hearings are supposed to work. And Crockett made sure that every single person watching understood exactly how broken this situation truly was. But she wasn't done, not even close. Because after exposing Bondi's refusal to engage, Crockett pivoted to something far more important than procedural drama. She pivoted to the survivors, the real human beings who walked into that hearing room carrying wounds that most of us will never fully understand. And the words she used to address them were not political. They were not performative. They cut straight through everything and landed like a declaration. She looked at those survivors and she said, "You are not victims. You are survivors. And you have more courage and moral clarity in your pinky fingers than the entire Department of Justice." Let that sink in. The entire Department of Justice, thousands of lawyers, investigators, prosecutors, and agents collectively outclassed in moral courage by the survivors sitting in that room. That is the world we are living in right now. And then Crockett said something that should have dominated every headline in this country. She said that America has become the laughingstock of the world, not because of our enemies, not because of foreign adversaries, but because of failed leadership inside the DOJ itself. Because kings and queens are falling around the world, meaning accountability is happening everywhere else, while inside the United States, the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet cannot distinguish basic right from wrong, cannot or will not. And that distinction matters enormously, because there is a massive difference between an institution that is broken and an institution that is deliberately, intentionally, strategically choosing to look the other way. Now, here is where the script flips completely, because Crockett didn't stay in the abstract. She went straight to the written testimony that Bondi herself submitted to the committee. Bondi stated, in her own words, under her own signature, that when she took office, she had 2 main goals. First, to end the weaponization of justice. Second, to return the Department of Justice to its core mission. 2 goals, clear, specific, on the record. And Crockett looked her dead in the eye and said, "Not only have you lied about both, you have intentionally done the exact opposite." That is an extraordinary accusation. That is a sitting member of Congress telling the Attorney General of the United States to her face on the record with cameras rolling that she is a liar. Not that she made mistakes, not that she misunderstood her mandate, that she lied deliberately, intentionally, and then did the precise opposite of what she promised. And the evidence Crockett brought to back that up was not vague or speculative. It was specific, documented, and damning. Because while Bondi was claiming to end weaponization, Washington, her DOJ was spending taxpayer money arresting journalists, not investigating them, not questioning them, arresting them. Don Lemon, Georgia Fort, journalists arrested by the Department of Justice of the United States of America. And it gets worse because Crockett pointed out that a judge had already rejected the DOJ's attempt to arrest Don Lemon once before. A grand jury rejected their case against Senator Kelly. A grand jury rejected their case against Senator Slacken. The case against Tish James was dismissed. The case against James Comey was dismissed. Case after case after case, thrown out, rejected, dismissed. And yet this same Department of Justice, with this track record of failure and overreach, somehow still had the audacity to sit at that witness table and claim they were restoring integrity to American law enforcement. The numbers don't lie. The court records don't lie. And Jasmine Crockett made sure Pam Bondi had nowhere left to hide. But everything I just told you, the survivor testimony, the journalist arrests, the dismissed cases, the failed prosecutions, all of that was just the opening act, because the moment Crockett said the words Jeffrey Epstein, the entire temperature of that room changed. And what she revealed next about Trump, about those files, about what federal investigators actually documented, is something that the DOJ does not want you to know, does not want you to discuss, and has gone to extraordinary lengths to make disappear. So ask yourself this. If there is nothing to hide, why did the Department of Justice scrub those documents from its own website? And that is exactly the question that should keep every single American up at night, because what we are talking about now is not political theory. This is not speculation. This is not a partisan attack designed to score points in a hearing room. What Jasmine Crockett placed on the record in that moment was sourced directly from the Epstein files themselves. Documents, investigator notes, FBI records, the kind of material that governments spend enormous amounts of energy trying to classify, delay, redact, and ultimately bury. And the reason they bury it is always the same. Not because it is irrelevant, but because it is too relevant, because the names inside those files are too powerful, because the connections inside those files are too damaging, and because the truth inside those files threatens something much bigger than any single politician or any single administration. So let us go through the facts exactly the way Crockett laid them out. Because she did not come into that hearing room with rumors. She did not come with gossip. She came with a numbered list, cold, documented, precise. And fact number one was this: Donald Trump is one of the most named individuals in the entire Epstein file archive, not one of the more commonly mentioned names. Not someone who appeared a handful of times in passing, one of the most named, and the scale of that presence is something that genuinely stops you cold when you hear it for the first time. At least 5,000 files, 5,000 separate documents containing more than 38,000 references to Trump, his wife, or his property Mar-a-Lago, 38,000 times across 5,000 files. That is not a coincidence. That is not a clerical error. That is a pattern. And patterns in federal investigative documents do not appear by accident. Now let that number sit with you for a moment before we go any further. Because in any normal criminal investigation, when a name appears that many times across that volume of documentation, that individual becomes what investigators call a person of significant interest. That phrase has legal and procedural weight. It means the documentation around that person is substantial enough to warrant serious, sustained, dedicated investigative attention. And yet here we are. The files exist. The references exist. The documentation exists. And the Department of Justice, the agency specifically tasked with following that documentation wherever it leads, has not only failed to pursue it, but has actively worked to make those documents disappear from public view. That is not incompetence. That is a decision. Someone made a deliberate choice. And Jasmine Crockett stood in that hearing room and said that out loud to the person most responsible for that choice. But Crockett did not stop at the numbers, because numbers alone, as staggering as they are, can still be dismissed by the people who want to dismiss them. So she went further. She went to specific documented incidents, specific names, specific interactions. And this is where the testimony became something that cannot be explained away with political talking points or deflection tactics. Because fact number two was not abstract. Fact number two was this: Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell made young girls available to Donald Trump on multiple occasions. That sentence, sourced directly from the Epstein files, was spoken out loud on the record in the United States Congress. And the Attorney General of the United States sat there and said nothing. Think about the weight of that for 1 second. Ghislaine Maxwell, who is currently serving 20 years in federal prison for sex trafficking, is documented in these files as having personally presented a young girl to Donald Trump. And according to those same files, Trump spent more than 20 minutes with that young girl in what investigators described as flirting. 20 minutes documented in federal investigative records with a girl that Maxwell, a convicted sex trafficker, personally brought to him. And we are supposed to believe that the Department of Justice looked at this documentation and concluded there was nothing worth investigating further. We are supposed to accept that because Jasmine Crockett does not accept that. And frankly, anyone with a functioning moral compass should not accept that either. And then came the second specific incident, and this one is somehow even more disturbing than the first because this was not just a documented interaction, this was a documented transaction. FBI investigator notes, actual notes from federal agents doing their jobs, describe Jeffrey Epstein personally transporting a victim to Mar-a-Lago, not to a public event, not to a charity dinner, to Mar-a-Lago, Trump's private residence and club, to meet with Trump directly. And according to those same investigator notes, Epstein introduced that victim to Trump with the words, and these are the documented words from the FBI file, "This is a good one." That is what a convicted pedophile said to the current president of the United States while handing him access to a trafficking victim. "This is a good one." And Trump received that introduction at his own property. Now, Crockett was careful here. And it is important to acknowledge that she was careful because she said explicitly, "I am not saying the president is a pedophile." She drew that line clearly and deliberately. But what she also said, and what the documentation fully supports, is that there is substantial evidence in these files that Trump maintained very close friendships with multiple men who are pedophiles. And that is a statement that the files themselves back up. Because when you are named 38,000 times in the investigative archive of the most notorious child sex trafficking operation in modern American history, the burden of explanation falls on you, not on the people reading the files. On you. And here is what makes this entire situation even more suffocating in its implications. Because this is not just about what happened in the past. This is about what is happening right now. Because the administration that is currently in power, the administration headed by the man whose name appears 38,000 times in those files, is the same administration that controls the Department of Justice that is supposed to investigate those files. Do you understand what that means structurally? The subject of the investigation controls the investigators. The person whose name saturates the evidence controls the agency responsible for pursuing that evidence. That is not a justice system. That is a protection racket. And Crockett named it as exactly that, a cover-up, not a failure, not an oversight, a deliberate, active, ongoing cover-up with the full institutional weight of the federal government behind it. And the cover-up does not stop at the Epstein files, because while the country's attention was locked on those 38,000 references, the DOJ was simultaneously engaged in a completely separate set of actions that paint an equally terrifying picture of an agency that has been completely captured. Federal agents were having their own misconduct investigations killed internally. Voter data was being seized from Fulton County in what Crockett described as an attempt to interfere with the 2026 midterm elections. A senior border official was allegedly caught on tape accepting a bribe, and the investigation into that bribe was quietly buried. And on top of all of that, the same administration was positioning itself to receive a $230 million payout that Crockett described as flatly, explicitly, constitutionally prohibited. The Constitution is not ambiguous on this point. A sitting president cannot receive any payment beyond his salary while in office. Full stop, no exceptions, no loopholes, and yet here we are. So step back and look at the full picture that Crockett painted in that hearing room. A DOJ that arrests journalists but protects powerful men connected to child trafficking. An attorney general who refuses to answer questions while submitting written testimony that her own actions directly contradict. A president whose name appears 38,000 times in sex trafficking files who now controls the agency investigating those files, a government seizing voter data, killing bribery investigations, and preparing an unconstitutional payday for the man at the top. And all of it happening while the survivors, the actual human beings who were trafficked, abused, and exploited, sit in that hearing room watching the system that was supposed to protect them perform its own corruption in real time. But here is what Crockett understood that most people in that room did not want to acknowledge. None of this is accidental. None of this is the result of bureaucratic confusion or political inexperience. Every single one of these decisions, the document scrubbing, the journalist arrests, the killed investigations, the seized voter data, every single one required someone to make a deliberate choice. Someone with authority, someone with institutional power, someone who knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. And that means this is not a story about a broken system. This is a story about a system working exactly as the people in power designed it to work, for them against everyone else. So now, the question that nobody inside that building wanted to answer out loud, and the question that should be burning in the back of your mind right now is this: if the Department of Justice is willing to arrest journalists, kill bribery investigations, seize election data, and scrub Epstein documents from its own website all at the same time, what exactly are they capable of doing to the people who keep asking questions? And more importantly, who is going to stop them?